Hi, everyone. Welcome to this very special and unique 20-year retrospective with Gideon and Mikhail. There's so many linkages that permeate through tonight's webinar that I think we should call it 0 degrees of separation. Because it's also the 20th anniversary of One-to-One Children's Fund. And while our retrospective and vision for the future will unfold during the year, this is a perfect occasion to launch our South African Art for Art series, which Josh will tell you a little more about later. But why Art for Art? Art for ART. Art has always been at the forefront of political and social expression, exemplified in South Africa during those dark AIDS denial years when Gideon was documenting and photographing the impact in the community, while Mikhail's mother, Dr. Eve Mendel, Gideon's aunt, was helping to administer different. Sorry, Gideon?
Sorry, my sister, not my aunt.
Your sister. Sorry, your sister. Gideon's sister, which is Mikhail's mother, was helping to administer a different kind of art, ART, at a time when One-to-One Children's Fund had started the first art treatment program for children at Groote Hospital. And this was in 2002. When we had to get around government policy to set it up as a research project with the University of Cape Town. And 300 children, including many from the local orphanages, were enrolled on that one-to-one art program, which the government took over 3 years later. And since then, we've been supporting the rollout of art in the hugely challenging Eastern Cape, ensuring that every pregnant mother-to-be is tested for HIV, and if she's positive, receives art, which should ensure that the virus is not transmitted to her baby. And on the Wild Coast, where we work, 25% of expectant mothers are HIV positive. And over the past 3 years, thanks to our amazing mentor mothers who deliver house-to-house mother-child healthcare in the home, they are trained to, many of them are HIV themselves. Many of them are on ART, and they're the ones who are delivering the care. And as a result, we've had 0 transmission of HIV to their babies, even though you have this 25% rate. But we need to keep it that way. And we're focused on the first 1,000 days of each child's life, from their nutrition and weight gain to their parenting and their early development. And this is the ART, the art that we're supporting, and it's inspiring to link it to the contemporary art that has emerged in South Africa over these past 20 years in particular. And Gideon and Mikhail are at the forefront of photographic art, and they both convey important messages and questions through their work. And it's going to be fascinating tonight to hear their narratives in conversation together. And Josh Ginsberg, director of the A4 Art Foundation in Cape Town, is ideally placed and informed to introduce their work and to guide the Q&A after. Josh will also be our guide for an exciting Art for Art week next month, and he'll tell us a little bit more about that later. So huge thanks to Gideon, to Mikhail, and to Josh for sharing their work and their insights with us this evening. Josh, over to you.
Thanks, David. Hi, everyone. Gideon, Mikhail, of course, it's a total pleasure and privilege to be here with you guys. Firstly, I'd like to say from an A4 point of view that it is also a privilege to be associated and working closely with David and Art for Art. It is, I think, pertinent that artists and artworks engage not only the issues of the time, but that they play a role in awakening and stretching the imaginations and perceptions of people in all different directions. And so it's a fantastic opportunity to think about artists and think about artworks that can not only inspire us, but also challenge us to think differently about how we contribute in the role we play. David and I have been talking for some time about a trip of some kind where we hope to bring in Will at some point, bring a bunch of individuals interested and excited to support Art for Art to South Africa to engage both the programs and artists. With COVID, it has put I suppose, a span or at least a delay onto that. And in place, we've devised an opportunity to engage artists in a slightly different way. And as David mentioned, in the middle of March, we plan to do an intensive kind of lunchtime lecture exchange where 5 artists will present ideas related to their processes and effectively the manner in which they make and the reasons they make, which I'll guide along with potentially some other contributors. More on that soon. The email that introduced Mikhail and Gideon does more than I can possibly do. Gideon, although we've never met, I've admired your work through Mikhail and through others for some time, and it's a privilege to be here. Mikhail, of course, you and I are in conversation continuously, so again, it is great to see you on the other side of the screen. But with that, I would like to say actually that I recommend to you all to explore their respective websites. Gideon, Mikhail's work I know fairly well, and again through our conversations, but Gideon, yours I mind, and I was quite taken aback, quite maybe is an understatement, by the scope and breadth and engagement that was present there. So I really suggest to everyone following this that you do a deep dive on both their respective web platforms. So with that, I'll hand over to you guys. Thanks again, and I'll keep an eye out for some questions. And by all means, please, to the audiences, pop some questions in the Q&A, and I'll do my best to filter those and share them if there's time at the end. Over to you guys.
Thank you so much. So, Mikhail, are you there?
I think you're muted, Mikhail.
Sorry about that. I'm unmuted. I was just saying thank you to everybody for having us, and to Josh for introducing us. And I'm really excited. Gideon and I talk all the time, but it feels like we've maybe never done this before. And I hadn't given it much thought until we started preparing, and then I realized how much there is to talk about and how interesting it all is to me. So hopefully everybody will find it interesting too.
Yeah, I mean, initially when we sort of each provided 5 images. Well, Mikhail first provided 5 images to publicize the event. I took a look at those images and I sort of tried to select mine in response to those. And I think it was a beginning of us sort of seeing a lot of, really interesting kind of parallels and kind of continuities, in our respective practices. So over here, the picture on the left, you may have seen as Mikhail with his very first camera prototype. He used to kind of have a stone, which was a camera.
Well, it was really just me at a certain point wanting to be like my Uncle Gideon, and so pretending that my rock was a camera. But in thinking, and Gideon took this picture of me, which was in one of my family albums for many years, and in starting to look at the parallels, and actually for something that I was working on recently, Gideon sent me this picture of himself after he had been shamboked by the police photographing one of the protests, and in the mid-80s, and that we think was probably the same or very close to the same year, so 1985. That looks like a 4-year-old to me, and it just gives a sense, I guess on the one hand, it's this very kind of touching connection, but it also gives such a sense of the crazy separation of worlds that we were kind of engaging in, but how close together they were, because Gideon would come along from Joburg and he'd stay with my family, and then go off to photograph, and then probably stop photographing at a certain point and come join us on the beach or something like that. I mean, you'd know better than me, Gid, but it just, for me, speaks to how close those different realities were, but how violently separate they were as well.
And I think, I mean, it was, I guess, quite a strange experience, I suppose, at that phase of my kind of life. I was in my kind of mid-20s, living between those two worlds. And I think there were, I was, kind of a young photographer, and I was very kind of taken and moved by the kind of mass mobilization that I witnessed at that time. And I was kind of, it was a sort of initiation of fire. I was like thrust into, situations of kind of violence, confrontation, a kind of the joy of kind of mobilization and the horror of the state's brutal and violent repression. And I photographed many funerals, I photographed death and dying. And I think in a way, I felt quite sort of overwhelmed, in a way that the rest of my life felt really insignificant compared to what I was photographing.
Gid, the protest where you were beaten and shamboked, was it this protest at Pollsmoor, or was it a different one?
It was, in fact, so what happened in 1985, in August 1985, there was an attempt, Cape Town, when the rest of the country had been kind of erupting in 1985, Cape Town had been relatively quiet. And there was a call to march on Pollsmoor prison to release Nelson Mandela. I think it was the 28th of August, 1985. And, thousands of people and protesters gathered, and the police kind of violently broke up those kinds of protests. And it was the beginning of the kind of uprising in Cape Town. And I think, this picture was taken, so in the kind of week after that, there was a huge, I think hundreds of people, were injured, and I've forgotten names, but a lot died in that confrontation. And I was photographing in Athlone, just an area close to where I took the original picture, probably, half a mile away, where there were kind of barricades and protests and kind of confrontation between the police and youths. And myself and cameraman Craig Matthews and another photographer, Murray Michelle, were photographing from a balcony. We were on a balcony photographing that, and the police kind of stopped and saw us, and they ordered us to kind of leave the area, and which we didn't do. And half an hour later, they kind of came across us again photographing, and they kind of just attacked us with what South Africans are doing, something called a sjambok, which is a flexible rubber whip, which you see in that picture. So we were attacked with kind of shamboks. I mean, truthfully, it was widely publicized and it's a powerful picture, but, the people I was photographing were affected much worse. I mean, it was very painful. It took a couple of weeks for the welts to go down, but it wasn't the most terrible of injuries, which I witnessed and saw. I mean, returning to this picture and these two pictures, I mean, for me, this is one of the most, I suppose, one of my most iconic pictures. And it's almost about the two different gazes, and the guy on the left, he's about to be attacked. He's about to be really hurt, and he isn't moving. He's staying there unflinching. And I find that remarkable. And I have a sense that he's kind of looking beyond that policeman, sort of into the future.
Yeah, it is incredibly powerful. And then to build on the connection, then, as we all know, in 1990, Mandela was released. And this is in front of the City Hall in Cape Town, just around the block from where A4 is. Me and Josh were walking there the other day and actually talking about, questioning which balcony Mandela had been on when he gave that speech. But it links back because I was 9 in 1990, and I remember watching it from our comfortable, suburban home on television, and it was really kind of one of my first memories, political memories, I guess. And I feel like my kind of political consciousness started with the fact that, that this was obviously this great occasion, but also it was so involved with Gideon because we knew Uncle Ged was there. And I think we actually caught a glimpse. Well, actually, my sister Anya caught a glimpse of him on television as Mandela was walking out of the prison. I actually didn't see Ged, but I think she caught a glimpse of him. And so, yeah, it was all connected. And then, I mean, long story, but years passed, and I became a photographer, largely influenced by Gideon, and then kind of went to art school in 2001, 2003. 2004, I started my own project in Pollsmoor, and after spending a year photographing there, making images like this, the first exhibition, and I still say the most important exhibition I've ever had, was in Pollsmoor prison, in the cell where Mandela was when those people were protesting, because he had been moved off Robben Island by then. And it was just a very important thing to have a couple of hundred members of the public come into a working maximum security prison and engage with the work, with the smells and the sounds and the kind of feeling of prison. And then also that a number of prisoners, including people I'd photographed, could see the work. Yeah, there's really not enough time for us both to kind of delve too deeply into our individual kind of projects, but one thing to kind of just talk to here for me is like the importance that I wasn't showing prison in isolation as this kind of exotic, otherized kind of space, and the photographs in the prison went with photographs of ex-prisoners whose lives and kind of stories were told moving in and out of prison. And I think the starkness of some of the contrasts here speak to what we were talking about earlier, where Gideon was kind of going between very, very different realities. And I felt like my photography at the time was really a kind of an attempt to put the world back together by going to places and seeing things that I wouldn't have otherwise seen. It kind of somehow made sense of how crazy the divisions in the society and inequalities were emerging as a young adult into it.
So, coming up to, kind of winding forward to the period when I was kind of deeply engaged with photographing HIV and AIDS, and at this particular point in time, which I think this picture was taken in 2003, very engaged with the kind of, I identified strongly with the struggle that Treatment Action Campaign was fighting for equal access to life-saving antiretroviral medication. And at a point when, people in the West with HIV were able to get medication and survive, and many people in Africa were dying terrible deaths. So it felt like a crucial struggle at the time. And I was sort of looking for different ways to tell the story. And I hit upon what at the time was kind of felt very exciting and very kind of free, kind of far ahead, was 360-degree technology, which was, working with a camera where you photograph, in a full 360 degrees. Each picture that I took here was made up of 18 separate, portrait position files, which are kind of joined together digitally. And I was actually doing some of this work in Swaziland. And my nephew, Mikhail, who at that point was, a talented art student at art school, came along as my assistant. I hooked him along as my assistant. So he kind of helped me, and he learned this technology from me at the time. And I have to say, I'm not sure if it was the right thing for what I was doing. I was trying to show people in their context, and I'm not sure if it was really such a creative success for me. But I think Mikhail took this technology into Pollsmoor prison, and it was completely designed for that space, to show the kind of overcrowding, to show the kind of almost nightmare fantasy, and the fact that these images are not one moment, they're kind of, they're a collage of 18 separate moments, kind of put together. So it also kind of questions the nature of the photographic moment and photographic reality.
Yeah, well, when I was assisting Gideon in third year, I was a little bit of probably a whippersnapper, and I was doing a project actually not far from Pollsmoor in the Muslim cemetery in Constantia, and Gideon was very gracious in allowing me to kind of use not just the technique that he was using, but also I think I started off using your panoramic head, which is something that calibrates the 18 photographs. And then, yeah, when the following year I started the work in Pollsmoor, and actually I have this memory, I was telling Gideon the other day of assisting him in Swaziland and talking about the fact that I may be able to get this access to the prisons. I'd kind of done one set of photos on election day in 2004. I might be able to continue it on with it, but I wasn't sure. And Gideon was just like, you'd be mad. If you can get access, go take photographs, which was kind of what I needed to hear as a slightly indulgent Michaelis student.
Yeah, so it just might, can you go back to the previous picture, Mikhail?
This one.
Yeah, so just I mean, I think the story of these two pictures kind of might be interesting to kind of for both of us to tell. For me, the top photograph, I'd arrived at the Treatment Action Campaign offices in Johannesburg, expecting that I would be meeting two people who I'd be photographing, that I'd planned that I would spend, the morning, go to the one person's house, and the afternoon go to the other person's house to do portraits of them in their environment. And I got to the office, and there'd been the miscommunication, and there were 23 people waiting to be photographed, who wanted to tell their story and be photographed. And I realized I couldn't reject them. And, so I had to think quickly and kind of pivot the idea. And then it became a day of kind of, in fact, constructing this. It became like a workshop, and we constructed this image. So in fact, the way panoramics work is that people were seated in a circle around me, because and that opens up to a line, and everybody wrote their own statement about treatment. And some people in the group had treatment, some didn't. And some people were keen to show their faces and be public, and some people wanted to hide their identity. So we arranged that people who didn't want to be seen would hold their signs in front of their faces. So it became, I suppose, a very, very different sort of statement. And it was in some ways, for me, the beginning of my practice in working collaboratively, working with HIV positive people in a way which engages them more than just photographing them, leading towards the Through Positive Eyes project, where we've effectively handed over the camera. And I'm no longer a photographer, more of a facilitator. And Mikhail, I'd love to hear the story of your photograph.
Well, it's interesting because there's a connection there in that when I was making this photograph, I said anybody because obviously in prison you've got to be careful about photographing who wants to be photographed and not who doesn't. But the funny thing is that almost everybody in prison wanted to be photographed, to the point where I had to stop, because I would take photos back to give to people, and it was such a valuable currency in prison to have a photo of yourself that you could send to your girlfriend or your daughter, your son. So I had to kind of stop doing that, because everybody just wanted to be photographed the whole time, and was kind of kind of wanted to pose with their gang signs and stuff like that. But I really didn't want it to be a fetishization of the gangs. So for me, it was very much about the overcrowding, primarily as a reflection upon my experience of South Africa at that time, 2004, where we had a constitutional court case around whether prisoners could or couldn't vote. And it was also at the particular high point or low point, one could say, of a particular kind of white middle and upper class kind of freak out about high crime rates. And the prison just felt to me like such an important part of that equation in a country where almost all of our political leaders have spent time in prison. So it was very much about looking at those spaces and making them visible rather than imagined. And from the point of view of the overcrowding, I mean, this was, I think, 80 or something prisoners in a cell which was designed for 18. And the panoramic technique really just allowed me to kind of show the full scale of the fact that these 80 odd men, this was their home for years and years. But yeah, I remember saying that if anybody didn't want to be in the photograph, they could just turn away or hide themselves, and there is somebody covering their eyes with some paperwork that seems quite similar to Gideon's one. And the one guy, his name was Jesus, the guy prominently on the right. You also see him towards the left on the top bunk, and he was one of those guys who really wanted to be in every photograph, and kept following the camera around. So I had to kind of in the end, I realized that it was okay if Jesus was in twice, that would be okay. So yeah, Ged, do you want to lead on this?
Okay, so what you see on the left are a collection of what I call the submerged portraits, pictures of people who've experienced flooding, and taken in 13 different countries around the world. And it's part of my Drowning World project, which is a kind of obsessive engagement. It has been a really obsessive engagement for me in the last, since 2007, I've been working on it and trying to get to floods in as many countries as I can. And
Gideon basically phones me like twice a week, or did in this period, phone me twice a week with some crazy dilemma. There's a flood, but I can't get there, but my son's at school, or this and that, and what should I do? So it was like this endless saga that Gideon just needed to get to the latest flood.
And yeah, and it's, I mean, I think this project is, I suppose, for me, been, I suppose, my attempt to address the kind of climate crisis we are, all in. But I think also the kind of way the narratives developed, and I think in some ways my work became much less documentary with this project, and I suppose a lot more conceptual. And so then there's the picture on the right, which is one of Mikhail's Ponte light boxes, which is an amazing project. I wanted to say a little bit about Ponty, Mikhail.
Well, you see, I think we might disagree here. I'm hoping we disagree on a bunch of things. And sorry to tease you again, but I think it's
Okay, well, the more disagreement, the better.
yeah. But so it's interesting because while Gideon was obsessing about floods, and let's not forget, it is an incredibly powerful and important body of work that speaks to one of the most important things going on in the world, as his 10, 15-year engagement with HIV/AIDS was really of its time and an important thing. I think this climate change work is the same. But while Gideon was obsessing about that, I phoned him at one point and said, I'm taking a photograph out of every window, every door, and every television screen in Ponty City. And I think he thought I was a bit crazy and didn't really see why I was doing that. And it was part of a project that I spent 6 years on with Patrick Waterhouse and blah, blah, blah. We did a book, etc. But we made these light boxes from composites, and they're completely accurate to the logic of the building. So floor 35 or whatever is above floor 34. It's an attempt to reconstruct the building through its apertures, and I've heard people refer to it as kind of conceptual work or less documentary work. I think it's the opposite. I think it's the most documentary work I've ever done, because it is producing a document which is some sort of kind of facsimile of the building, or kind of attempted facsimile of the building, and perhaps in the kind of German typological kind of tradition of photography, where there's a supposed objectivity, where the camera is kind of placed in repeatedly in the same kind of way in front of a subject. And Patrick and I joked about our approach being semi-German, because both in relation to that German photographic tradition, but also my kind of German heritage and the fact that stereotypically Germans are very fastidious and ordered. And we did everything we could to make it accurate, kept careful records, but like if there was a cupboard in the way of the window, we'd just photograph that rather than move the cupboard. So, but in essence, I think, and I probably think the same of your flood work. I'm sorry, Gideon, but like I see it as documentary in a beautiful sense.
Yeah, I mean, yes, it is, but I think perhaps a movement away from a kind of more conventional documentary approach, in the sense that the images are to some, are not documenting the situation. They are to some extent constructed, that people were positioned. It wasn't the situation I found. That I was active in those situations in a way. But Mikhail, back to Ponty, and I think I have to share that my kind of embarrassment, to some extent, that at the time I was just really disparaging about what you were doing. I think it was a kind of, I suppose, a point of some tension between us. And I had really just loved and had been so moved and impressed by the documentary work you were doing. And I kind of, at that point, I felt, when I heard about it, when you told me about it, I thought, you're such an amazing documentary photographer. And at that point, you were making documentary style images, which were kind of addressing the art world, and were very, I hate the word, but were institutions and galleries, were very keen to show them. You did an amazing book of your Beaufort West work. And I just thought, why are you pursuing this sterile kind of, fastidious sort of, box ticking kind of process, when there's such amazing documentary work you could be doing in that situation. So, and I mean, I have to say, I was, to my embarrassment, I was so wrong, because I think what you made, I think you're right, is a kind of enhanced documentary, and a really amazing and groundbreaking piece of work. I don't know what how you define it.
Well, yeah, I mean, sorry.
Yeah, and I think
it's interesting, because also I was collaborating with Patrick, which was, a big part of discovering new processes. And, when you were speaking about your Submerged Portraits and the kind of more active kind of, it relates again to that kind of August Sander German tradition. So it's interesting how our kind of work has kind of dovetailed and pulled apart and come together. I mean, when Git says that he was critical, I mean, I think that, honestly, the most valuable thing that Gideon ever taught me was this unbelievable criticality to you and seriousness. And, I would never show anything that you'd say, I just like that. You'd always kind of push, and it's incredibly valuable. And I really learned so much from that. So moving on, though, I mean, this is an installation photograph of one of the Ponty exhibitions. And so I look this way because I've got a second screen where I've got the slideshow. I'm not gazing out the window in case it's a bit weird. But this image, it shows like the variety of approaches in the project. There's the light boxes, there's traditional documentary style photographs, and then there's this kind of archive of found documents and images that are pinned on top. And there's not time to get into that, but Patrick and I found this huge amounts of materials in the kind of rubble of abandoned apartments in Ponty, very personal items from people who weren't there anymore that told the kind of stories that we couldn't tell with our documentary style photography. And so that became a very important part of the project. And it kind of leads us very nicely into the next kind of point of discussion, and the same with Gideon's work, where you described this, Gid.
Yes, well, I mean, as part of my kind of travels to flood zones around the world, I came across families whose personal snapshots, personal family photographs were water damaged. And I mean, at the start of it, actually, one thing which got me into it is my cameras in Haiti, my Rolleiflex cameras fell in the water. And it's a long story which I haven't got time for, but effectively, all my film was affected by moisture. And a lot of the images were messed up, but a few of them were really pretty interesting. But yeah, Michael, if you just go back to that Ponty picture briefly.
Ponty.
Yeah. So I mean, so there's a really interesting parallel that Mikhail, and I hadn't really thought much about it at the time, but that Mikhail was working with the distressed found photograph in that situation, and I was working with kind of images which had been messed up by water. And in both cases, it was sort of random. But before we leave Ponty, I mean, I think it's really important, Samuel, that the way I saw that I think I was distrustful of it at the time, but I think your collaboration with Patrick Waterhouse there also really sort of brought a kind of enhanced, having two visions working together.
Yeah,
I think did something kind of really interesting.
Yeah, totally.
With that project, and then.
Well, talking about distress, I mean, it's so interesting what was happening at the time, because I took a year in the middle of that Ponty project to do a body of work called Retinal Shift. It was an exhibition that toured, and it kind of put together work that I'd been thinking about and doing on the side of my documentary practice for quite some time. Yeah, it is interesting that like we're both kind of intuitively drawn to these kind of distressed images, photographs that have been damaged, roughly overlapping years. And then I had this totally different instinct, or the same instinct from a different angle during that time, where I had taken a very violent, terrible photograph of a prisoner's body who had died in Polsmoor, that haunted me for years. And I had smashed that photograph a little while before, and kind of started smashing various of my photographs to make a work initially called I Was Looking Back, which kind of reconfigured my work out of the specific projects that had been made for, and rearticulated very much around the gaze and the discomfort of the gaze. In this wall of 100 photographs, every person is returning my gaze with some sort of interest, either with averting their gaze or staring at me very intently, or there's a kind of representational complexity in each image that I chose. And I went through every single photograph I'd made in 8 years to choose those 100. And so the viewer is kind of confronted and implicated in this challenge. That's why I started smashing photographs. But at the same time, Gideon's work was lying in where?
So, I mean, maybe not quite coincidentally time-wise, but when I left South Africa in 1990, it was not an intentional, I wasn't planning to leave forever. And I left some boxes of negatives and transparencies and prints with with a friend. And to my shame, I kind of neglected them and kind of forgot about those boxes. And a lot of the material was outs and images which I hadn't chosen at the time. But also some of it I just hadn't looked at very carefully. And those boxes, well, in fact, one of them was water damaged and it was rained on. So kind of coinciding with my existing interest in kind of flood damage snapshots, I found some of my own work from the 1980s that had been damaged by water. And I mean, there was in just a few of these something quite remarkable going on, sort of, and they are completely unintentional, the random impacts of time, mold, and water, which I think coming to this work, kind of 25 years later, was quite a big experience for me, and it sort of opened up a lot. And I think it's been really important for me to open myself to happenstance, and kind of when things happen like that randomly. And there were interesting parallels going on with Mikhail's work, which you can talk about with your sticky tape transfers.
Yeah, so coming out of 2011 when I did Retinal Shift, I was smashing things. I think there was a lot I wanted to destroy, and I'm like, I really believe very strongly in the relationship between photography, obviously all artists, but particular photographers' work and their kind of internal worlds, a kind of psychological reading, which is really at the center of how I understand the world. And it became more and more necessary for me to smash things and pull them apart. And it came from the very deep mistrust of images and mistrust to some extent of my own instincts in making some of the images that I've made over the years. And so the sticky tape transfer process came out of that, where I started pulling found images apart and kind of reconstructing them in ways that I felt like kind of got me inside the image and allowed me to kind of re-articulate it around something that was more honest than the kind of frozenness of an image as it was when found. And this is quite nice because I did this while working on a project called Y, which was looking at kind of delving into the landscape and excavation of personal histories, etc., and very much beginning now to look at whiteness and white masculinity. So I made this sticky tape work from that picture that Gideon had taken of me, and another found picture of a water diviner. And I hope Josh isn't going to be cross with me for saying this, but there's a nice connection because this work has found a home at the A4 Foundation. So I think looking at the time, we should probably keep moving. We also both have made films. Gid?
Yeah, and we've also both made multi-channel video installations. We've both made work which, can be, kind of, I mean, for me, it allows to tell in a way a very kind of complex narrative. And so the piece of mine you see here is something called Deluge, which is a 5-screen video installation, which sort of puts together all the various kind of narrative threads of the Drowning World project. And I mean, why don't you explain why, which I think is also a really interesting piece.
Yeah, so like most things I make, they're kind of overly complex in ways that can sometimes be self-defeating. So again, I'm not going to get into it too much, but why is really on 3 screens the story of 3 protagonists from the past, present, and the future, and they kind of all 3 of them converge on this one beach across these times, and there's a sense actually, again, looking for parallels of the kind of at the start and the end of each film, the camera flies out to the horizon and you just have this kind of watery horizon and returns. And for me, it was very much about that kind of space of the beach as the place where the white man lands and looks at the land, and how the very first process of looking at it is the kind of the catapult towards taking ownership and stealing it, and causing huge amounts of destruction, which can be measured in many things, including what we've all done to the environment that Gideon has documented and put together.
And Mikhail, why don't you show a clip of your film, and why don't you show the brief clips? I think it might be interesting to get just a sense of them.
Sure.
If that works.
Sorry, I just need to jump out to do that. So this is yours. Maybe we can play more at the end if there's time.
That's
Did you hear the sound in that? Was that coming through?
Yeah, came through.
Okay, and then this is a piece of mine. Let's actually just back this up a little bit.
So we are breakfast, take further down, down.
Deep enactment commencing now. Yes. Lighter.
And then, yeah, I guess we're getting towards stuff that we're working on at the moment, or in recent times.
Yeah.
So the image that I have of mine on the right here is a portrait of Rudolf Steiner that I muted. I went to Rudolf Steiner school and have very ambivalent feelings about it as an education, and particularly about Rudolf Steiner's ideology, which I've been reading about since I left the school, thankfully. And yeah, so it's become a big part of my process. My work kind of the sticky tape transfers were about destroying the image by pulling the ink away from the support, and then it became necessary with images like this, which was from Y, to kind of ghost that image away. So I was kind of scrubbing away at the back of the images, and I'm like a bit of a neat freak and a germaphobe, and didn't really want to get involved in this mess with the ink and stuff. And my wife had to really push me to do that. I wouldn't have done it without her incredible kind of help and pushing me towards that. But then once I was moving the ink around, I realized I kind of needed a more robust surface to do this, and that's why the work kind of moved on to the front of the image, which is then, you know, canvas was that surface that I started working with, erasing faces and eventually building up more kind of layers of of imagery.
And the image of mine on the left is kind of part of a very new project I'm actually working on with my son Eli, which we've tentatively called Writing Over Memory, or kind of maybe subtitled Excavating Our Family Archive. But essentially, we've ended up kind of being the repository of a huge archive of family documents and photographs relating to the history of my parents, Alf and Rose, who escaped Germany before the Second World War and made a life in South Africa. And I have a huge archive, photographs taken by my grandmother, who I discovered actually studied photography in Berlin between 1914 and 1917. Photographs taken by my grandmother, other family photographs, documents. So the picture on the left is a detail of one of my grandmother's photographs taken in the Alps in 1938. And what's super kind of merged with it is a detail of a document from which my grandfather received when he was released from Sachsenhausen concentration camp in 1938. He was amongst the 8,000 Jews who were arrested on Kristallnacht, and the majority of them were released. And he was one. So this was his release document just 3 weeks after his arrest. And he left Sachsenhausen concentration camp and was luckily able to escape to South Africa very shortly after that. So what Eli and I are doing, both with stills and actually making animations, is kind of positioning documents and images, over each other, in relation to each other. This is the start of a huge project. It's going to take us years. We've got so much stuff to work through, such a huge archive. So it's a beginning of, a kind of a complex and really, it's one of the hardest things I've done. And, kind of looking at my family history, looking at myself, and also looking at my family's complicity of kind of, to some extent, of, leaving the oppression of being Jews in Germany, and, the identity of then becoming, going from being good Germans to bad Jews, and then to being white South Africans. And, with all the compromises which that involved. And
surprise, I happen also to be doing an animation at the moment. This is a still. Actually, you can see behind me the actual canvas that this is a still of. I don't think it's changed much since I took that. But yeah, I'm working on what I see as my third film after the first two that were shown, Merson, Griffiths, and Why, and it's a kind of a look at a particular kind of strand of South African history that ends up in Cape Town, where I was grown up, and you can see the castle there, also just around the corner from A4, and looking at the idea of the Dutch Golden Age, when and just how crazy that is as a concept, a golden age that was based on slavery and thievery. And lastly, I think we probably need to get to questions, but I'll leave you all with this photograph, which is Gideon and me. Is that Halpe Beach or is that Noordhoek Beach? I don't know when that was taken, and myself holding Gideon's son Jonah. Also, I don't know when. But yeah, it's amazing how I mean, it's family. That's what family is. But to look back on this and how intertwined our lives have been, both in terms of the usual family stuff, but also I think both learning a huge amount from each other. And
absolutely, I mean, and I think I've learned an immense amount from you and your practice. And I mean, obviously I was older and was the first practitioner, but I think in a way you've we've I think there's been quite a reciprocal absorption over the years.
Yeah, guys, thank you for that. I think that's maybe an understatement, Gideon, of what is possible, when there's this level of proximity. Perhaps there's a great deal more opportunity, respectively, to sort of see parts of your respective works. Oh wait, have I stalled. Oh, there we go. Yeah, I can only imagine if you continue digging, that there'll be things that start to happen that, you know, you can't even imagine at this stage, that are intimately linked to those histories and the nuances of the respective families. It's kind of astonishing. There are a few questions I want to touch on. Well, maybe I'll just, there's two people who have asked a similar kind of question, Gwydion and Lauren. They both want to know when you are going to do something together. You guys can hold on to that question and think that through. But I suppose there is the archive, as you pointed to, Gideon, and sort of moving through it seems to be such a pertinent part of both your approaches, that perhaps there is something in there of moving through a shared family history. Is there a plan to do something together? Is that something that seems feasible?
Not in a, I don't think in a kind of obvious way. I mean, what's your thought, Cohen? I mean, maybe it's something we might come to at some point.
Yeah, look, I mean, to be honest, also we're more like brothers, I think, than uncle and uncle and nephew, whatever it is. You know, and because Gideon's was a lot Lamaki, so he's kind of in between generation between my parents and myself. So there and I think there's. Look, let's be completely honest. Like, there's this wonderful relationship that we've spoken to about here, but I think there's also, like any siblings, there's kind of sibling feelings and stuff. So,
of course,
and I think that you know, just putting this together and actually talking like this has really kind of maybe just brought to consciousness for me of how I guess important to me some of these interconnections are, and whereas maybe sometimes, like in the past, the overlaps felt uncomfortable, for instance, with the panoramics, and, you know, and maybe now it just seems wonderful and interesting to me. So I don't know if it will be, I don't know what form it will take. And we both, as we said now, kind of working and engaging with family history and kind of personal stuff. So, but at some point it would be really wonderful to kind of bring the work together in some way, not necessarily collaborating, but potentially showing some of these overlaps.
I mean, I totally agree. I mean, I think we've both been quite kind of surprised to some extent by what we found this last week when we begun kind of excavating and kind of, you know, looking at the process. And I mean, I think showing our work in a museum or gallery in relation to each other could be really interesting.
Yeah, but the opposite is also true, that perhaps the collaboration is real already, and that is that it's a conversation. It takes its form in a series of nuanced kind of overlaps and influences, and that is itself, and it's actually more vivid than any like sort of articulate rendering or sort of imagined rendering.
Yeah,
absolutely. And if I can just add to that, Josh, I mean, I've just had all this time with you in your space with Linda Kuchler Sabekwa, where he's younger than me, and I think in many ways, in what was, you know, initially a kind of more like formal kind of mentorship kind of role, I was really trying to kind of engage with him in the way that I'd learned that Gideon engaged with me as a when I was a young photographer, in terms of that criticality and that kind of the things that are really hard as a young artist or photographer is really editing and being critical with one's own work. And it's just, you know, we had that experience in your space where that relationship, which, you know, wasn't directly collaborative, but like created a kind of conversation that was so alive and so rich. And
well, that was incredibly impressive, I must say, like to observe. And I suppose that's a reflection of your guys' relationship, was the level of like, critical encounter that was possible between you and Linda. Real, rich, honest engagement with what was in front, which only led to benefits for both sides. And I was quite taken aback by what mentorship can look like. I thought it was quite remarkable. And again, I think that's testimony to what you guys have had the privilege of having with one another. If I can, there's not much time, but I have it's a question, but it's more like a terrain, and you guys pointed to it respectively. I just want to poke it a bit more. The watermark series, the damage series, I found those like particularly astonishing, and particularly in relation to some of the more direct actions of the early photojournalism, you could say, and the same could be said of Mikhail, of projects. You noted them already: the Smash series, the sticky tape transfers, and then most, to my mind, the paintings. And the question is around chance, and you touched on it, Gideon, like autonomy, agency of the thing itself. Of course, photographing people in the real hinges on chance opportunities and taking those chances. But there's something else, and maybe this is the question: is there something else about the material doing a work of its own, speaking back to you and leaving you in a position where you're perhaps a bit more of an observer? Yeah.
And I think for myself, certainly over the years, kind of an engagement with kind of almost visceral materiality has felt really important. You know, the kind of how objects can speak.
Right, the thing.
Something, you know, so, and, you know, for a lot of different projects, I'm a magpie. I collect things, you know. I sort of go and I come back, you know. I've been photographing the fires in Australia, and I have a huge collection of burnt objects, which I plan to do something with. You know, I worked in the Django refugee camp, and I collected discarded things, you know. So I have this obsession, you know, maybe it's quite acquisitive, of kind of acquiring objects to make work with. And I think that also parallels, I think, with a lot of Mikhail's work about, you know, the way objects and textures and kind of materials can kind of act in the world.
Yeah, I mean, Mikhail, you've so acutely moved your ideas through different materials, and I think your animation at the moment is testimony to that curiosity, and also that a different kind of chance now, not so much the material pushing at you, but taking a chance on a medium that is not necessarily your first language, but being confident enough as a maker to kind of let it speak back to you.
Absolutely, and I think it is about that kind of tightrope walk between kind of control and chaos or chance. And I mean, painting now, it's the kind of ultimate battleground for that, where you can never be in complete control. And there's something so interesting creatively in that, and it's something I'm really enjoying at the moment. But it is interesting what you said, Josh, because there is a huge amount of that in documentary photographic practice, like where one goes, who one opens oneself up to speak to, you know, and without wanting to get into the kind of like separation of the worlds in which I've worked in, but I do think, I think what's really great to see in all of this, and in relation to Gideon as well, is the threads, you know, that the medium might be completely different, the context might be incredibly different, but the kind of line of inquiry and the inquisitiveness about ideas or the world, I think in both of our bodies of work is, you know, consistent yet evolving, and I think.
And
yeah, I suppose there's sorry, Gideon.
I say that the many intertwining threads, you know, which and it's. I think what's been really interesting about tonight is just somehow teasing out these different threads and the way our work and our histories have kind of woven through each other.
Yeah, there's a dynamic and a tension that I think is resting between the articulation of an external world, the subjects that are being rendered, and then the internal world of you guys respectively, and the sort of challenge of making the ethics associated to the things that come your way, and then the autonomy of those objects. And I think that tension is quite astonishing and evident across the board. With that, guys, I think we, in the interest of like Zoom etiquette and the explicit nature of the beginning and ending of things, which is quite astonishing, I just want to thank you guys explicitly for this. Gideon, again, we've never met, but this was a complete privilege. Mikhail, I'll speak to you tomorrow, I assume, or soon enough. No, a great pleasure to be here. Just another note to the fact that in the next short while, we'll be sharing some information about a week-long kind of lunchtime intensive exchange with a series of South African artists, exploring specifically their process and sort of through particular works of theirs. David, no doubt, will share some more data on that soon. I look forward to seeing you all there and to supporting this incredible cause. Thanks and good night.
And yeah, thank you.